Hello and welcome to our conversation, Creating Consumer Demand for Geothermal. My name is Patrick Hanson, founder of Geoenergy Marketing, passionate about all things geothermal, and I get to professionalize and promote the industry to the masses. I'm joined here by Peter Tait, founder of Customer Engines and fellow marketer. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks.
I am going to introduce you briefly and we'll get right into this. Peter's been working in the Bay Area tech industry since the mid-'80s, when he moved here from New Zealand. During the 90s, he moved from technical roles to marketing and has built or contributed to marketing teams at dozens of companies, from garage startups to multi-billion-dollar corporations. Much of that work has been in promoting new or disruptive technology in emerging markets. And earlier this year, he began volunteering that experience to geothermal and our community as a way to contribute to the renewable energy transition. Peter, I'd love for you to fill in the gaps if I left any and to explain further about why we're having this chat.
This conversation's got an interesting genesis because I am literally married to geothermal, in that I have to be a little bit careful here because this effort I'm doing is entirely personal, but my spouse, Anne Robertson Tait, I think is fairly familiar to most people in the geothermal community. And I realized that my interaction with geothermal actually goes all the way back to driving around the Wairaki field with Anne when she was doing her master's degree and helping her measure stuff. So technically speaking, I suppose I go back to about 1984. But all of that time, I've been watching the geothermal community from the outside. And it's been clear from the beginning that this is a fantastic story to tell, but it's had a lot of trouble getting serious traction over that period of time. And we're right now, this conversation came about because of the paper that I decided to write and start circulating to talk to people about the idea of stepping outside our usual marketing to the geothermal community and talking to each other and talking to ourselves, and maybe talking to direct customers of geothermal energy production like utilities, and reaching out to the end consumer. Because in a lot of the spaces that I've worked in the last 30 years, you really need to market the aspirational and the what you think is possible with what you're doing, as opposed to being stuck in the very mechanical, here's what we can deliver on this project right now. And in some ways, from a marketing perspective, this is a sort of, to quote Wayne Gretzky, this is a skating to where the puck is going to be. And the paper started late last year, and I started circulating it to people early this year, not really anticipating that the pandemic and other things in society are basically driving a complete and utter transformation. I mean, it feels like fossil fuels are over, at least in a lot of people's minds. And, the reality will go on for many, many, many years, but I think conceptually, a lot of people have made this transition. And geothermal has, I think, the best possible story to tell, but we haven't created the feeling in the mind of the consumer that it's something they have to have.
Right.
And I think, we can go into a whole lot more detail, and I hope we will over these next few sessions, about why that's important and how to do it.
Right.
But that was the basic genesis of why I started writing this down and circulating it to folks in the geothermal community.
Well, we will be diving into this over our 3 segments of this conversation, and I'm really excited to provide a bit of a platform for you to share this inspiration, because it changed the way I looked at how I run my business and my goals to promote the industry. So I really appreciate that. Could you walk us through a bit more about what's the goal of consumer side demand generation?
I think perhaps these are a little bit lofty in some ways, but I believe that geothermal should have the same public perception as solar and wind, and now storage. And storage, to me, is the most amazing counterexample, because there isn't really very much of it yet. There's gigantic investment. And when I asked people, folks I knew who were actually involved in community energy regulation, if they switch to completely electrify things, where does their power come from on a calm night in California? They said, well, they just assumed there was storage somewhere. Yeah. And so I realized that the other players in this space, and this shouldn't be a competitive thing, but the other players in this space have created the impression in the public's mind that the solution to the climate change problem, the switch to renewables, the getting off fossil fuels, is really all about wind and solar primarily, and storage, and a few other things. So I think one goal is that geothermal should be, in terms of public perception, should be up on the same level with those other technologies. The second goal is to drive demand from consumers. We want consumers to be saying, where is my geothermal in my mix? I'm a customer of the first MCE, the first community aggregator, I guess, in California.
Okay.
And my light green power option has a few percent, 5% geothermal, something like that. The deep green, the really responsible green option, doesn't have any geothermal. And that was an immediate head scratcher of, okay, it's more green by having no geothermal in it. And that's got to change. And the third goal is creating the perception that including geothermal is valuable. And that's slightly different from consumers wanting it. I think we have to tell the story of why geothermal as part of your mix has grid stability aids. It has renewable energy aids. It has perhaps local industry or local jobs value, and it saves the planet. And then the last goal is that we have to improve the brand for geothermal with the people who regulate it.
You're right.
In one of the Pivot 2020 sessions, someone said, you know, if you check the box that, if you don't check the box that this well is geothermal, you get your permit in a week. If you do check the box that it's geothermal, it takes 3 months, right? So that's obviously not a positive brand perception.
No.
And then related to that, investors need to have a much more positive perception of the geothermal brand, because then investment will flow into new innovation. And there's a group that I call influencers. They are not influencers like the people who get 100,000 followers on Instagram necessarily. I mean the influencers, the tastemakers who define how the larger community thinks about renewable energy and climate change. So those would be think tanks, analysts, etc. So those are the 4 goals. Get geothermal publicly up on the same level as wind and solar, create consumer demand, express the value of geothermal to the end consumer and to society as a whole, and get regulators and investors to understand it. So that should be easy, right?
Yeah, it sounds like a walk in the park.
Right.
It definitely would require and will require a lot of rethinking and retooling about what our industry has always done. And I think that geothermal over the last 12 to 18 months has started to embrace that change and recognize that. But I do believe that the blueprint was pretty blurry for them. And I think your paper and what we're going to talk about over this session and the next 2 help materialize what has been a little blurry, so to speak, into what we need to do, whether it's you and I or a group of like-minded professionals to carry the industry forward. I think that's a great stopping point to tease the next couple segments. Thank you again, Peter, for your time. We're going to jump in the next segment and talk about the difference between marketing price versus aspiration, and then my favorite new topic, ingredient branding.